Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today we're diving into a pretty important figure when you start thinking about how we understand the mind and how we study it. How we even got to where we are today. That's Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt.
Right.
A lot of people call him like the father of experimental psychology. Setting up that very first psychology lab back in Leipzig in 1879. But this guy, Wundt, he was a real intellectual powerhouse. His work, it went way beyond just psychology. I mean, we're talking physiology, philosophy, linguistics, ethics, even politics.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling. They estimate his total written output to be something like 53,000 pages, including these huge landmark works like his Grundzüge der physiologischen Psychologie and Völkerpsychologie.
It's really important, I think, when we come to Wundt to keep in mind that even though we remember him for those contributions to psychology, his real aim, it was much broader, much more foundational. He wanted to create a real system, one that could bring together philosophical and scientific perspectives.
Kind of put it all together, huh?
Yeah, a real synthesis. And because his career was so long, so productive, there's still a lot of debate about how internally consistent his whole doctrine really is. There's a lot to sift through. There might be threads that don't quite connect perfectly or tensions you can find across his writings.
A lot of food for thought. And for our listeners out there, especially you folks coming from a philosophy background, our deep dive into Wundt today, it's going to focus on two really crucial points. First off, we've got his arguments from the 19th century that are all about, well, a non-reductionist way of understanding consciousness. And that stuff, it provides a ton of really rich ideas and some really stubborn challenges, too. These aren't just some historical footnotes, This stuff is alive in philosophy of mind today.
For sure.
Still relevant,
Yeah.
Still sparking debate.
And the second thing that makes Wundt so important, especially from a historical perspective, is that you really can't understand the development of modern philosophy without grappling with his ideas. He had this huge influence even when people were reacting against him. Think about thinkers like the folks who laid the groundwork for pragmatism and phenomenology and neo-Kantianism, all grappling with Wundt.
So he was shaping the conversation.
Exactly.
Even in opposition.
And not only that, but we have to acknowledge the role that he and his students played in developing the actual empirical methods that would eventually separate psychology as its own distinct field from philosophy. I mean, he really helped establish how we do psychology today.
Okay, so to sum it up, our mission in this deep dive today, it's to unpack these parts of Wundt's thought that are really relevant to philosophy, like the real meat and potatoes for us. We're going to explore his very unique approach to psychology. What made him different? And what did that mean for the philosophical landscape of his time? And we'll be digging into how he dealt with those big 19th century philosophical currents, especially that big shadow cast by Kant.
Oh, yeah.
With his arguments against the very possibility of a scientific psychology.
A huge challenge.
So let's jump right in, shall we?
Let's do it.
To really wrap our heads around why Wundt is so important to philosophy, we've got to understand, the world of ideas he was living in.
Right.
Back in the early 19th century in Germany, you have this field of psychology that's just getting started.
Right.
But it's facing this massive obstacle. And that's Immanuel Kant and his argument that a scientific psychology is basically impossible.
A roadblock right there.
It might seem weird now, but back then, psychology was seen as part of philosophy. Like it was a subdiscipline. And Kant, he had these really specific objections that made it tough for people trying to study the mind.
Yeah.
He was like, psychological phenomena, you can't measure them mathematically. And he doubted that you could isolate individual mental states, like to manipulate them in experiments. But maybe his biggest point was that introspection itself, the very act of looking inwards at your own mind, that it changes the things you're trying to observe.
Yeah, kind of like, how do you measure the temperature of water without affecting the temperature itself by sticking a thermometer in there?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that left people who wanted to empirically study the mind in a really tough spot.
Yeah.
It was like their subject was off limits to proper investigation,
Yeah.
and their main tool was broken.
And Kant's successors in philosophy, they weren't offering any clear solutions either. The German idealists, they were all focused on these abstract ideas of spirit, Geist, and they tended to build these very speculative systems that weren't so grounded in real-world observation.
He's very practical.
Not really. And then you have Johann Friedrich Herbart. He tried to bring in mathematical rigor with this idea of mental mechanics.
And to quantify thought.
Yeah, but ultimately it lacked that empirical foundation. real-world evidence.
Okay, but at the same time that all of this is happening in philosophy, you have huge leaps forward in human physiology,
Right.
particularly in how we understood the senses.
Yeah.
And this is where the work of Ernst Heinrich Weber comes in. So important. In his 1834 book, De Tactu, Weber presented this amazing finding. He was doing experiments on the sensation of weight, and he found this consistent ratio between the strength of a stimulus, so like how heavy something is, and the smallest change in that stimulus that a person could notice.
Like the just noticeable difference.
Exactly. And this relationship, it held true no matter how strong the initial stimulus was.
Wow.
I mean, it's like this underlying law governing how we perceive changes.
That's remarkable.
Now, what's really interesting for us, from a philosophical point of view, is that Weber's law, which we often write as delta I over I equals K, it seems to show that experiments could work when it comes to studying the mind. Right in the area where more abstract philosophical approaches like Herbart's had failed, it was like saying, maybe Kant was a bit too quick to judge.
Right.
Maybe there are these hidden laws in our subjective experience waiting to be discovered through careful, systematic investigation.
So challenging that Kantian roadblock.
Head on.
And we should mention Gustav Fechner here, too. He really built upon Weber's work and gave it a psychophysical interpretation, trying to get a real mathematical formula for how physical stuff relates to mental stuff. Though Wundt, he would come along later with a different take on what their findings really meant.
And that's precisely where Wundt comes in. He really created this middle ground between these existing approaches,
Right.
a compromise of sorts.
Yeah.
He didn't buy into what he saw as Fechner's mystical, even metaphysical interpretations. But he did see the value in Fechner's commitment to experimentation. And at the same time, he wanted to go beyond purely physical explanations for what was happening in physiological experiments, like the ones championed by Hermann von Helmholtz.
Right.
Wundt was convinced that when it came to humans, at least, the right kind of experiments could uncover these law-like regularities in our inner psychological world.
Yeah, he wanted to find those hidden laws of the mind, and that's why he came up with the term physiological psychology, to describe this kind of hybrid science he was creating. It was a way to acknowledge those two sources of influence. You had the empirical rigor that you find in physiology, and then the focus on psychological phenomena, and it's this very definition, along with the meticulous methodology he developed and even his underlying assumptions about the nature of reality, that makes physiological psychology so fascinating for us, both for historians of philosophy and for philosophers of mind today who are still wrestling with those same questions about consciousness and how mind and world connect.
Like his work bridges those two worlds.
Definitely.
So let's get a little more specific now. What exactly was Wundt trying to study when he talked about experimental psychology? What was the object of his investigation?
He actually laid it out pretty clearly. The exact description of consciousness, Bewusstsein, in his words, is the sole aim of experimental psychology. And he went on to explicitly say that physiological psychology was basically the same thing as experimental psychology. Now, this is super important for us as philosophers because what Wundt was saying is that he wasn't directly interested in the brain as a physical organ or in just physical processes. His goal was to use experimental methods to achieve a truly scientific understanding of consciousness itself.
Of that inner experience.
Exactly.
And like you mentioned earlier, that relies on two pretty big assumptions that philosophers would be really interested in unpacking.
Right.
One, that consciousness can even be studied experimentally.
Which Kant, of course, denied.
Big time.
Yeah.
And two, that consciousness is the right thing for psychology to focus on in the first place. That's a point that the behaviorists would later challenge.
Yeah, for sure.
But let's tackle that first Kantian objection. How did Wundt respond to that?
Well, Wundt, he defined a consciousness as this inner experience, right? It's the stuff that's immediately real to us, the phenomena that make up our entire subjective awareness at any given moment. He was saying psychology shouldn't waste time speculating about some underlying substance or hidden entities beyond this immediate experience,
Okay.
which is what makes it different from physiology, the study of bodily processes, and psychophysics, which tries to map out how physical stimuli and sensory experiences relate to each other.
So trying to be very precise, very focused in his definition.
Absolutely. Wundt was aiming for what some people call a psychology without a soul.
Interesting.
And maybe even more radically, a science that doesn't need any metaphysics, any underlying reality beyond what we can observe.
So a hardcore empiricist then,
Yeah.
just focusing on what's right there in experience.
Totally. He believed the subject matter of psychology was completely defined by what you could observe about it, its predicates. And those observations had to come from direct internal
So
experience.
introspection was key.
It was foundational, and his main focus was on individual psychology, looking at the actual mental contents of specific people, not some abstract universal idea of a mind or some set of innate faculty.
Very concrete.
Very much so. And his push to make individual psychology a rigorous science by manipulating inner phenomena through experiments, that shows a real pragmatic streak.
Pragmatic in what sense?
Well, he thought the science, the body of knowledge, that stuff comes from actually doing experiments, from trial and error in the lab. Instead of just accepting Kant's word as gospel and saying a scientific psychology is impossible, he pointed to Weber and Fechner.
Right.
Their work was proof that you could study at least some parts of inner experience in a controlled way, and you could even describe it using math.
So concrete evidence wins over abstract pronouncements.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he's got his object of study.
Uh-huh.
But how did he propose to actually study this inner experience in a way that was genuinely scientific?
Well, remember Kant had those big criticisms about psychological experimentation?
Oh yeah, those were pretty damning.
Wundt knew the challenges. How do you stimulate the mind-body in a controlled way and then interpret the reactions in a way that gives you pure psychological insights? He noticed that in physiology, those experiments with stimuli and responses, they're really all about physical events you can observe, like excitations and reactions and nerves and muscles. Imagine, electrically stimulating a nerve in a frog's leg.
Okay.
The muscle twitches, right. That tells you about the physiology of the nerve and the muscle, but it doesn't say anything about what the frog might be feeling, about its inner subjective experience, if it even has one like we do.
Right, it's just a chain of physical cause and effect.
Exactly. So Wundt's big innovation was to add a special set of psychological procedures on top of those classic physiological experiments. He called it Selbstbeobachtung, which is often translated as introspection. But to be more accurate, especially for philosophers who care about how we know things, it's more like self-observation done under very controlled conditions.
So it's not just like casual self-reflection. It's a more disciplined, rigorous way of looking inward.
You got it. And because inner experience is defined by how immediately accessible it is, it's the stuff that's just given to us, Wundt argued that all psychology has to start with this carefully trained self-observation. Physiological experiments become the supporting tool, providing the controlled stimuli to bring out those specific conscious states. And he knew about that old philosophical criticism of introspection, how the observer and the observed are the same thing.
He's a bit paradoxical.
Right. So he was very careful to say that his method was different from the kind of loose, potentially misleading introspection that a lot of empirical psychologists were doing at the time. Wundt thought that kind of introspection could lead to a lot of self-delusions, Selbsttäuschungen.
Because if you focus your attention too much, you might change or even block the very thing you're trying to observe.
Exactly. He thought that when people tried too hard to focus, it could mess up the very processes they wanted to study. So his fix was to focus on unexpected processes. These are things that just pop up involuntarily. You're not trying to force them. The idea was to look at immediate reactions to controlled stimuli, not get bogged down in long, drawn-out analysis.
So kind of trying to catch consciousness off guard in its natural state.
In a way, yeah. And he envisioned these super controlled lab settings. You'd have a trained experimenter, a subject who's usually also trained, and this precise equipment, all designed to trigger those specific conscious phenomena over and over again in a very controlled way. And the psychologists, they're not primarily interested in the psychophysical connection, like the link between the physical stimulus and the inner experience. What they really care about is carefully describing and, if possible, measuring those psychological regularities, those cause and effect relationships within the mind itself that these experiments could uncover.
So this fancy physiological setup is just a means to an end. A way to get those conscious states to show up so you can observe and analyze them rigorously.
Exactly. And Wundt argued that these psychological experiments, when done right, they do something for consciousness that scientific experiments do for the outer world. They don't just sit back and watch. They actively probe, they question consciousness, they force it to respond under controlled conditions. And that, he thought, allowed for true scientific observation, this focused, regulated pursuit of phenomena, which is different from just regular, everyday perception, Wahrnehmung.
So you're not just seeing what happens, you're guiding the process.
Right.
Okay, so Wundt's laid out his object of study. He's got a method that he thinks can stand up to Kant's criticisms. What did he actually find? What did his experiments about this individual psychology reveal? Like, what were the basic building blocks of consciousness for him?
Well, like a lot of the early folks in experimental psychology, Wundt, he started by focusing on sensation and perception. He thought of sensations as the psychic phenomena, the mental stuff, that's most directly connected to the body and the physical world. Those key points of contact between the physical and the psychological.
Right, that makes sense. Sensations usually come from external stimuli that hit our senses.
Exactly. And the sensations, Empfindungen is what he called them, they held a unique position. You could study them from two sides.
Two sides.
Yeah, you could look at the external physical stimulus that caused it, and at the same time, you could analyze the internal psychological part, the mental representation or Vorstellung that goes with it. So the Wundtian psychologist, they would manipulate the external conditions, the physiological stuff, in the lab, and that would create all sorts of internal representations, and then a trained subject could observe and describe them through introspection.
So very meticulous, very controlled.
Very much so.
And were these representations what Wundt considered the basic units of consciousness?
Yeah.
Like the fundamental building blocks?
He did. He thought all those complex representations that make up our conscious experience, they all come from these simple sensations at their core.
Okay.
But he emphasized that we never experience those sensations on their own in their pure form. They're always combined or verbunden into these more complex representations. Those are our perceptions of the world.
So it's all about how things get put together.
Exactly. And because our conscious experience is always made up of multiple things, Wundt said you need to use careful analytical introspection to pick apart those underlying basic sensory components.
So a kind of mental dissection.
Right.
Now, what were those basic irreducible elements of sensation that Wundt found?
He came up with three. He called them the differentiae of pure sensations.
Wow.
Quality, intensity, and what he called feeling tone, or Gefühlsten.
Three fundamental dimensions of every sensation.
Yep.
What about quality? What did that mean?
Quality is like the difference between seeing red and seeing blue, or hearing a high note versus a low note. Each sensation has its own unique quality that sets it apart.
So it's about the type of sensation. Makes sense.
Right. Then there's intensity. That's how strong the sensation is.
Like how bright a light is or how loud a sound is.
Exactly. And then feeling tone is the emotional side of sensation, like whether it feels pleasant or unpleasant, exciting or calming.
Oh, that's interesting. So every sensation has this kind of built-in emotional quality. Okay. And how did he bring intensity into his experiments, especially when you can actually measure the physical stimuli out in the world?
Well, he knew you can measure the intensity of things out in the world, objectively with instruments. But for psychology, the important part is figuring out how much our own subjective estimate, our Schätzung of how strong something is, actually matches up with the real physically measured intensity. That's where the whole field of psychophysical measurement came in.
And what were they trying to achieve with those measurements?
Two things. One, they wanted to figure out those threshold values where a tiny change in the stimulus becomes noticeable as a change in sensation. Like, how much louder does a sound have to be for you to actually hear the difference? And two, they wanted to find those lawful relationships between how much a stimulus changes and how much the perceived intensity of the sensation changes. He thought you could indirectly measure sensation intensity by looking at how our subjective experience changes in response to those controlled changes in the stimuli.
So you manipulate the physical world to see how the mind reacts. And this brings us back to Weber's law. You talked about that earlier as being pretty important for Wundt.
It was.
How did he understand it within his own psychology, especially when it came to measuring sensation intensity?
Weber's law was like a prime example for Wundt.
Yep.
He said that the smallest noticeable difference in the intensity of a stimulus is always a constant ratio of the original stimulus intensity. So to feel a difference in how strong a sensation is, the stimulus has to increase geometrically, not just by adding the same amount each time. And Wundt, he really dug into the different ways you could interpret what Weber's law was really about. Some people, they looked at it from a purely physiological angle. They thought it reflected how neural excitation works.
Okay.
Then you had the psychophysical interpretation, the one Fechner was a big fan of, which saw Weber's law as a way to quantify the fundamental connection between the physical and the mental. And then you had Wundt's own take, his psychological interpretation.
And he wasn't satisfied with the first two. What were his problems with those?
He thought the purely physiological explanation was too simple.
How so?
Well, he said that when we judge how intense a sensation is, it's not just about those initial signals in the nervous system. Our minds are actively involved. He believed that what he called the center of apperception, a really crucial part of his system that we'll get to in a minute, that plays a big role in how we experience and judge the intensity of sensations.
So it's not just about passively receiving sensory input.
Yo,
The mind is doing something with that information.
it's an active process. And Wundt argued that we can't actually know how those initial signals are experienced consciously without this active process of apperception.
It's all intertwined. So for him, Weber's law was really about those apperceived sensations. And it could just as easily be about how we compare sensations in our minds as it could be about that initial physiological response.
Exactly. He saw Weber's law not as a law about isolated sensations themselves, but as a law describing those mental processes involved in comparing sensations. And he was adamant that you wouldn't even be able to estimate how intense a sensation is without this active apperception.
Fascinating. So Weber's law, for Wundt, was more about how we think than how we sense. And how did that psychological interpretation fit into his big picture?
It let him argue that the mental world and the physical world are distinct, but not necessarily in conflict. Physiological experiments, they could give you mathematical results. But those results, they're really describing relationships between sensations as we experience them consciously. He thought his psychological interpretation had this big advantage.
What was that?
Well, it left the door open for a future, more complete physiological explanation, once we understood the brain better, unlike those other interpretations that tried to reduce everything to either the physical or to some vague psychophysical realm.
So it was more open to new discoveries.
Definitely.
Okay, so that's how Wundt understood sensations. What about consciousness as a whole? How did he build on those basic sensory experiences?
Well, he broke conscious experience down into three main categories: representation, feeling, and volition, or will. We'll mainly focus on representation and volition for our discussion today, since we're looking at this from a philosophical angle. And while he separated representations, those are the contents of consciousness, from the act of representing, which is the mental activity, he was clear that they're really two sides of the same coin. They're inseparable. And this is all part of what he called his theory of actuality, actualitates theory. For Wundt, mental states, like representations, they're really acts, they're dynamic, not static objects with fixed properties.
So it's not about things in the mind, it's about actions, about processes.
That's the key. Consciousness is active, it's doing something. And that idea that content and process are always linked, that's central to what's been called his monistic perspectivism.
We've heard that before.
It's a recurring theme. He always stressed that those psychic processes are one unified flow, and the distinctions we make, like between representing, feeling, and willing, those are just for us, to help us analyze and understand. They're not really separate things.
They're just aspects of a single process.
Yeah.
So it's all interconnected. But how do these representations actually get created in the first place?
Like we talked about, it all starts with sensations. But he said we never actually experience them alone, in their pure form.
Right. They always get combined.
Exactly. They get synthesized into those more complex representations, Vorstellungen, which are basically images or ideas of things in the world. And he went further, distinguishing between perceptions, Wahrnehmung, which are when you have a direct sensory encounter with something, and intuitions, Anschauung, which emphasize the active mental work that goes into paying attention to and interpreting those perceptions. And if you're thinking about something that's not directly present to your senses, that's a reproduced representation.
So like remembering a past experience.
Yeah, or imagining something. And these basic sensations, they get shaped into more complex representations through a kind of formative process. Sensations get connected in time, like when you hear a sequence of notes in a melody, or they get connected in space, like when you see different objects arranged in a scene. And this constant flow, this coming and going of representations, that's a big part of what consciousness is all about.
So it's dynamic. Things are always changing.
Always. And based on his research, Wundt said that every representation is ultimately built through a psychological synthesis of sensations. It's this active process of putting things together.
Like mental building blocks.
Exactly. And he thought this ability to combine sensations into representations is a core feature of consciousness itself.
So consciousness isn't just passively receiving information. It's actively building something. It's creating meaning.
Precisely. But it's not just about those representations flowing by.
There's more.
We're also aware that we're focusing on certain representations, right? We're paying attention to them. And that's where Wundt's concept of attention comes in. He explained it by saying that representations can be present in our awareness with different degrees of vividness, and that corresponds to how much our consciousness is actually focused on them.
And he used that analogy of inner vision to explain it.
Yeah, he was really fond of that analogy. He compared our conscious awareness to a big inner field of vision, a Blick field.
Okay.
And all the representations that are present at any given moment are in that field, but some are clearer than others, depending on how much attention we're giving them. And the part of that field that we're really zeroing in on, that's our inner focal point of vision, or Blickpunkt.
So it's like there's a spotlight in our minds.
Kind of, yeah. And when a representation enters that broad field of awareness, that's what we call perception, Wahrnehmung. But when it moves into that sharp focal point, when we really engage with it, that's apperception. So the scope and intensity of consciousness, it all comes down to where our attention is directed and how focused it is. It's broad and not so focused when it's perception, and it's narrow and intense when it's apperception.
And it's in this realm of apperception where the really important work of consciousness gets done.
Right. It's where the mind is actively shaping and processing things. And apperception, it can be either active, where we're choosing what to focus on, or it can be passive, where a really strong or interesting representation just grabs our attention.
So sometimes we're in control, sometimes we're not.
Yep. And Wundt said there's no hard line between perception and apperception. They sort of blend together.
Okay.
It's like when you focus your attention more and more on something, the field of perception narrows, and it gradually becomes apperception. The representation in the center gets brighter, more distinct, and the stuff around the edges fades away.
So it's a smooth transition.
Mhm.
What's the key difference then between that apperceptive focus and just regular perception?
The big thing about apperception is that it always creates this unitary representation. The more focused our attention is, the more intense that representation becomes in our minds. And importantly, Wundt emphasized that how intense something is in apperception, that isn't determined by how strong the physical stimulus is, or even by those initial physiological effects.
It's something else.
It's about the internal activity of consciousness, the effort we put into focusing on that stimulus.
So it's about the mind's own effort.
Exactly. And that's where the connection to the will comes in for Wundt.
Right. He saw apperception as a kind of active will.
He did. He said that the act of apperception is always an inner active will, a Willenshandlung. And he contrasted that active volitional part of apperception with more passive processes of association. He thought those were responsible for putting together those initial representations and making them available to our perception. But they do that without us needing to pay attention. So passive apperception, that's when those associations bring a representation to mind. And active apperception, that's governed by what he called apperceptive connection, where our minds are making choices about what to focus on.
So just passively connecting ideas isn't enough to explain how our minds actually work.
Not for Wundt. He thought it was too simple.
Because we're actively choosing, we're directing our attention. And that's where his concept of voluntarism comes in.
Precisely. He believed that associationism, on its own, couldn't fully explain that active, goal-directed nature of consciousness.
Right.
He thought association was more like a pre-conscious process, like it's happening under the hood. And then the products of that association, those representations, they become the things we can be conscious of.
So association sets the stage, but apperception is the star of the show.
Exactly. And apperception, it follows its own rules when it comes to putting things together, Verbindung, and taking them apart, Zerlegum.
So it's got its own logic.
In a way, yeah. And while association might give you some initial combinations, like seeing a tower and a church together and then associating them, Wundt said apperception is what creates those really new integrated representations, the ones that have their own unique properties. He called this process agglutination. Like when you think of a church tower, it's not just the separate ideas of church and tower added together. The idea of church kind of sticks to and modifies the idea of tower, giving you something new.
So it's more than the sum of its parts.
Right. And apperception can then go even further, creating even more complex representations from those initial agglutinated ones through processes like compression, Verdichtung, or displacement, Verschiebung. And over time, those original elements can become so blended together that you don't even see the original parts anymore.
So it's like baking a cake.
How so?
You start with individual ingredients, but in the end, you have something completely new. You don't see the flour and eggs anymore.
That's a good analogy. And Wundt saw this kind of representational synthesis happening at higher and higher levels of thought, eventually leading to those abstract concepts where the original sensory or perceptual basis is really hard to even identify.
So it's a process of building up from the simple to the complex. But apperception isn't just about building things up, is it? It also involves taking things apart.
Right, and that's where aperceptive separation comes in. This process works on those pre-made representations we've got stored up in our minds. Wundt called that our associative stock, our associations verath. But it doesn't always mean breaking things down all the way back to the original sensations.
Okay.
And Wundt's take on a perceptive separation, that's actually a pretty original idea. He said that often our initial experience is this original representational totality, an ursprüngliche Gesamtvorstellung, which is kind of this messy, undifferentiated clump of stuff.
Like a big jumble of thoughts and sensations.
Yeah. And it's only through apperception, through that active separating function, that the individual parts and how they relate to each other become clear and distinct in our minds. Host speaker.